In the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, a scream shatters the morning calm. Mr. Harold Finch, the jovial butcher, lies dead, a cleaver in his chest. As whispers of scandal ripple through the cobblestone lanes, Miss Jane Marple, with her knitting needles and razor-sharp mind, unravels a web of secrets, a cryptic ledger note, a hidden scandal, a scorned lover, and a bitter apprentice. In a locked shop where time is the only witness, who wielded the fatal blow? Trust Miss Marple to uncover the truth in this chilling tale of betrayal and murder. Chapter 1. The Village of St. Mary Mead. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its golden light filtering through the ancient elms that lined the high street. In this tranquil village, where the rhythm of life seldom faltered, Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles moving with the quiet precision of a metronome. Her cottage, with its whitewashed walls and neatly trimmed roses, stood as a sentinel of order amidst the soft chaos of nature. From her wicker chair, she could see the comings and goings of the village, the milkman's cart rattling past, the postmistress bustling toward the shop, and the faint hum of activity emanating from Mr. Harold Finch's butcher's shop across the lane. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her pale blue eyes scanning the scene with a deceptive mildness. She had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to know that beneath its placid surface lay currents of human passion, envy, greed, and secrets carefully guarded. The butcher's shop, with its gleaming windows and cheerful red awning, was a hub of village life. Mr. Finch, a burly man with a booming laugh, was known for his skill with a cleaver and his penchant for gossip as sharp as his blades. Yet this morning, an unusual stillness hung about the shop, broken suddenly by a piercing cry that cut through the air like a knife. By noon, the village was abuzz with the news. Mr. Finch had been found dead, sprawled behind his counter, a meat cleaver buried deep in his chest. The discovery was made by young Tom Carver, his apprentice, who had arrived to open the shop and promptly fled to summon Constable Hurst. The constable, a methodical man with a square jaw and a distrust of complexity, had sealed the premises, and whispers of murder spread like wildfire through St. Mary Mead's tea rooms and parlours. Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea, listened as her maid, Florence, relayed the details with wide-eyed excitement. "They say it was a dreadful sight, miss," Florence said, her hands twisting her apron. "Blood everywhere, and that cleaver. Oh, it's too horrible to think of." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind already turning over the facts. A murder in St. Mary Mead was rare, but not unprecedented. She recalled the case of the poisoned curate some years ago, and the curious affair of the missing silver teapot. Human nature, she knew, was a constant, whether in a bustling city or a quiet village. As Florence bustled off to prepare lunch, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of her friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose flushed cheeks and hurried step betrayed her agitation. "Jane, have you heard?" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, settling into a garden chair. "Poor Mr. Finch, murdered in his own shop. Arthur says it's the work of a madman, but I'm not so sure. There's something queer about it, don't you think?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her fingers brushing the soft wool. "Queer, indeed," she murmured. "A meat cleaver is a brutal weapon, Dolly, but it is also a personal one. Whoever used it knew Mr. Finch's habits and had access to his tools. I wonder—" She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the butcher's shop, now cordoned off with a constable standing guard. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. "You're thinking something, Jane. I know that look. What is it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only that a village is a small place, Dolly. People talk, and in their talk they reveal more than they intend. Mr. Finch was well liked, but no man is without his detractors. I should like to know who was in the shop this morning and who was not. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. Then you'll look into it. Oh, Jane, you must. Constable Hurst is a dear, but he hasn't your knack for seeing what's under one's nose. Miss Marple demurred, but her resolve was firm. She would observe, as she always did, from the sidelines. Her garden, her tea parties, her quiet walks through the village. The truth, she knew, lay in the ordinary details. A glance exchanged, a word unspoken, a step out of place. As the sun climbed higher and the village settled into its uneasy murmur, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her needles clicking like the ticking of a clock. The murder of Mr. Finch was a puzzle, and she intended to solve it. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The High Street of St. Mary Mead, usually a picture of pastoral calm, was transformed into a stage of hushed excitement as villagers gathered in small knots, their voices low and their eyes fixed on the butcher's shop. The red awning, once a cheerful beacon, now seemed an ominous flag over the scene of a grim tragedy. Constable Hurst stood at the door, his broad frame barring entry, his face set in a determined scowl that discouraged idle curiosity. Behind him, the shop's interior was cloaked in shadow, the blinds drawn to shield the horror within from prying eyes. Yet, the air thrummed with speculation, and every passer-by cast a glance toward the sealed premises, as if the very walls might whisper the truth of Mr. Harold Finch's demise. Miss Jane Marple, her slight figure wrapped in a lavender shawl, approached the shop under the pretext of delivering a small posy of roses to Mrs. Finch, who was said to be resting at the vicarage. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever eager for a glimpse of drama, had insisted on accompanying her, her stout form bustling with barely contained excitement. "It's dreadful, Jane," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper as they neared the shop. "Simply dreadful. To think of poor Mr. Finch, struck down in his prime. Arthur says it must be a vagrant, some ruffian passing through, but I can't help thinking there's more to it." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, enigmatic smile. "People are quick to blame outsiders, Dolly," she observed, her tone mild but her eyes sharp as they took in the scene. "Yet, in my experience, evil is often closer to home. A meat cleaver is not a weapon one carries by chance. It belongs to the shop, to the man, to the life he led." They paused at the edge of the cordon, where Constable Hurst, recognising Mrs. Bantry's position as the wife of Colonel Bantry, grudgingly allowed them a closer look. "Mind you don't touch anything, ladies," he said, his voice gruff. "It's a crime scene, and the inspector from Much Benham will be here soon. We don't want anything disturbed." "Of course, Constable," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft and deferential, though her gaze was already roving over the shop's exterior. The door, painted a glossy green, bore a faint scratch near the lock, barely noticeable unless one looked closely. The windows, though shuttered, revealed a sliver of the interior through a gap in the blinds, and Miss Marple noted the glint of a brass scale, tipped at an odd angle. She adjusted her spectacles, her mind cataloguing these details as carefully as she would a skein of wool. Inside, the shop was a study in controlled chaos. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, mingling with the familiar scent of sawdust and raw meat. Mr. Finch lay behind the counter, his burly frame sprawled awkwardly, one arm flung out as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. The meat cleaver, its blade broad and wickedly sharp, was embedded in his chest, the handle jutting upward like an accusation. Blood had pooled beneath him, soaking the sawdust and staining his white apron a grotesque crimson. The counter itself was in disarray. A stack of butcher paper had been knocked askew, a tray of sausages lay scattered, and a heavy brass scale, usually polished to a gleam, was overturned, its weights scattered like coins. Miss Marple, permitted a brief glimpse under Constable Hurst's watchful eye, stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped around the posy. "Such a violent act," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "And yet there is a certain deliberation here. The cleaver was not thrown or dropped. It was driven with force. That suggests not just anger, but intent." Mrs. Bantry, hovering at her side, shuddered. "It's ghastly, Jane. Who could do such a thing? And in broad daylight. The shop was locked, wasn't it? That's what Tom Carver said when he found him." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to a wooden crate near the counter, its contents, packages of meat wrapped in paper, spilled onto the floor. "Locked, yes," she said thoughtfully. "But locks can be opened, Dolly, by those who have keys or those who know how to tamper with them. And this crate, why was it moved? It seems out of place, as if someone needed to reach something behind it." Constable Hurst, overhearing, snorted. "With respect, Miss Marple, it's likely just the mess of a struggle. The killer came in, did the deed, and fled. We'll find the culprit soon enough. Probably some drifter with a grudge." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of polite agreement, though her thoughts were far from aligned with the constable's. She stepped carefully around the counter, her eyes falling on a leather-bound ledger that lay open on a small desk in the corner. Its pages were neatly ruled, filled with Mr. Finch's precise handwriting. But the book was positioned oddly, as if placed there deliberately rather than left in the course of work. A pencil lay beside it, its tip broken, and a single sheet of paper protruded slightly, marked with a smudge of ink. "Dolly," Miss Marple said softly, "do you notice the ledger? It's not where one would expect it, is it? A butcher's ledger should be near the till, not tucked away in a corner. And that smudge, ink, doesn't smudge unless the hand that writes is hurried or unsteady." Mrs. Bantry peered at the ledger, her brows furrowing. "You think it means something, Jane? It's just a book of accounts, surely." "Accounts can tell stories," Miss Marple replied, her voice almost a whisper. "And stories can point to motives. I wonder what Mr. Finch's ledger might reveal about his customers, or his enemies." Constable Hurst, growing impatient, ushered them toward the door. "That's enough, ladies. The inspector will handle things from here. No need for amateur sleuthing." Miss Marple acquiesced with a nod, but as she stepped back into the sunlight, her mind was alight with possibilities. The scratch on the door, the overturned crate, the misplaced ledger. These were not mere accidents of a struggle, but pieces of a puzzle, each with its own significance. She thought of the villagers who frequented the shop, Tom Carver, the apprentice, whose sullen demeanour had been the talk of the Women's Institute, Mrs. Finch, whose quiet reserve hid something unspoken, Mr. Ellis, the grocer, whose rivalry with Finch was no secret, and Miss Clara Trent, the spinster whose sharp tongue belied her prim appearance. Each, in their way, was a thread in the tapestry of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple knew that one of those threads led to murder. As they walked back toward the cottage, Mrs. Bantry chattered on about the scandal, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She recalled a similar incident in her youth, when a dairyman in a neighbouring village had been found dead, his own churn used as a weapon. The solution had lain not in the grand gestures, but in the small details. A misplaced bucket, a word overheard, a glance that lingered too long. "The scene of a crime," she said suddenly, interrupting Mrs. Bantry's monologue, "is like a stage after a play. The props remain, but the actors have gone. It is our task to deduce who moved them and why." Mrs. Bantry blinked, then laughed. "Jane, you do say the most extraordinary things, but I suppose you're right. You'll look into it, won't you? I shan't rest until we know who did this awful thing." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with quiet determination. "I shall observe, Dolly. That is what I do best, and in St. Mary Mead there is always much to observe." They parted at the gate of Miss Marple's cottage, where the roses nodded in the breeze, and the knitting lay waiting on the wicker table. As Mrs. Bantry's figure receded down the lane, Miss Marple settled into her chair, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. The butcher's shop murder was no simple act of violence, she was certain. It was a calculated deed, born of motives buried in the ordinary lives of the village. The ledger, the crate, the scratch on the door. These were clues, small but telling, and Miss Marple intended to follow them. In the quiet of her garden, with the hum of St. Mary Mead around her, she began to weave the threads of the mystery, knowing that the truth, like her knitting, would emerge with patience and precision. Chapter 3. The Suspects Emerge. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobblestoned lanes as the village absorbed the shock of Mr. Harold Finch's murder. The initial clamour of horror had settled into a quieter, more insidious hum of speculation, as neighbours exchanged theories over garden fences and in the dim corners of the Blue Boar Inn. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her drawing-room with a cup of Darjeeling, listened as the village's pulse beat through the open window. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, for her mind was occupied with the faces and names now tethered to the tragedy at the butcher's shop. Murder, she knew, was rarely an act of impulse. It was a thread pulled loose from the fabric of human relationships, and in St. Mary Mead, those threads were tightly woven. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever a conduit for village gossip, arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, her cheeks flushed from a brisk walk and her eyes alight with news. "Jane, it's simply dreadful how tongues are wagging," she declared, settling into a chintz-covered armchair. "Everyone has a theory about poor Mr. Finch. Some say it was a robbery gone wrong, but I heard from Mrs. Price at the post office that there's bad blood in that shop." "Bad blood indeed." Miss Marple's eyes, pale and perceptive behind her spectacles, met her friend's. "Bad blood is a potent motive, Dolly," she said softly. "And in a village, it festers quietly until it spills. Tell me, what names are being whispered?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Well, there's young Tom Carver for one. That boy's been sulky ever since Mr. Finch took him on as apprentice. They say he wanted more wages, and there was a fearful row last week, shouting loud enough to be heard at the grocer's next door. Then there's Mrs. Finch herself. She's taken to the vicarage, pale as a ghost, but they say she's not shed a tear. Isn't that odd, Jane? A widow ought to grieve, oughtn't she?" Miss Marple's fingers brushed the wool in her lap, her expression thoughtful. "Grief takes many forms, Dolly. Some wear it openly, others hide it behind a mask. Mrs. Finch's composure may tell us more than tears would. Who else? There's Mr. Ellis, the grocer," Mrs. Bantry continued, warming to her task. "He and Mr. Finch have been at odds for years over some old debt. Something about a loan Mr. Finch never repaid. Mrs. Price says Mr. Ellis was seen near the shop early this morning, looking thunderous. And then there's Miss Clara Trent. You know her, Jane, that prim little woman who's always at the butcher's, buying scraps for her cat. They say Mr. Finch teased her something awful about her cooking, right in front of half the village. She went red as a beet, and hasn't been back since, until today." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing these names as carefully as she would a pattern in her knitting. Tom Carver with his youthful resentment, Mrs. Finch whose silence spoke volumes, Mr. Ellis nursing a grudge, and Miss Clara Trent, whose pride had been publicly wounded. Each was a figure in the village's daily drama, and each, she suspected, held a piece of the truth. "A butcher's shop is a public place," she mused aloud. "Yet a murder there feels personal. We must consider who had access and who had cause." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think it's one of them, don't you, Jane? Oh, it gives me chills to think of it. A murderer among us." "Not among us, Dolly," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Beside us, living as we do with their secrets tucked away. People are seldom as hidden as they believe. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple proposed a walk to the vicarage, where Mrs. Finch was said to be staying. The two women set out, their steps measured but purposeful, passing the butcher's shop, where Constable Hurst still stood guard. The crowd had thinned, but a few lingered, including young Tom Carver, who leaned against a lamp-post, his cap pulled low over his sullen features. Miss Marple noted his restless hands, twisting a piece of string, and the way his eyes darted toward the shop's shuttered windows. "A troubled boy," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry. "Trouble does not always mean guilt, but it bears watching." At the vicarage, they were received by the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, a kind but flustered woman who ushered them into a parlour where Mrs. Finch sat by the fire. The butcher's widow was a slight figure, her dark hair pulled tightly back, her hands folded in her lap with an unnatural stillness. Her face, pale and composed, betrayed no hint of the turmoil one might expect from a woman who had lost her husband so violently. Miss Marple, offering her condolences, studied her closely. "You must be in great shock, Mrs. Finch," she said, her voice soft as a breeze. "Such a terrible thing, and so sudden." Mrs. Finch's eyes flickered, meeting Miss Marple's for a moment before dropping to her lap. "It is overwhelming," she said, her voice low and steady. "Harold was a good man, though not everyone thought so. I was upstairs when it happened. I heard nothing until Tom came running." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy, though her mind noted the absence of tears, the careful choice of words. "Upstairs, you say? The shop must seem so quiet now without Mr. Finch's voice to fill it. Did he have many visitors this morning, before?" Mrs. Finch's fingers tightened briefly. "No more than usual. Tom was there, of course, and customers came and went. I don't recall who exactly. It was a busy morning." Mrs. Bantry, less restrained, pressed further. "But surely you heard something, Mrs. Finch? A cry, perhaps, or a commotion? The shop's not so large." Mrs. Finch's lips thinned. "I heard nothing, Mrs. Bantry. I was occupied with my sewing." Miss Marple, sensing the woman's reserve, changed tack. "It must be a comfort to know Mr. Finch was so valued in the village," she said, "though I understand he had his disagreements, as all men do, with Mr. Ellis perhaps, or young Tom." A flush crept into Mrs. Finch's cheeks, but her voice remained even. Harold had his ways. He spoke his mind, and not everyone liked it. But it was nothing serious, just village talk. The conversation yielded little more, and Miss Marple, thanking Mrs. Clement for her hospitality, led Mrs. Bantry back into the fading light. As they walked, she reflected on Mrs. Finch's demeanour, calm, almost detached, as if guarding a secret she dared not share. "She knows more than she says," Miss Marple remarked. "But whether it is guilt or fear, I cannot yet tell." Their next stop was the grocer's shop, where Mr. Ellis, a wiry man with a sharp nose and sharper temper, was restocking shelves. He greeted them with a curt nod, his eyes narrowing at the mention of Mr. Finch. "A bad business," he said, slamming a tin of biscuits onto the shelf. "But I'll not pretend I'm sorry. Finch was a cheat, overcharging and shortchanging half the village. He owed me money too, £50 from years back, and never a penny repaid." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "A considerable sum," she said. "Did you see him this morning, Mr. Ellis? Perhaps to discuss this debt?" Mr. Ellis's hands paused, then resumed their work. "I passed the shop around 8:30, on my way to market. Didn't go in. Didn't need to. Finch knew my mind." Miss Marple thanked him, her gaze lingering on his calloused hands, which trembled slightly as he spoke. Outside, she said to Mrs. Bantry, "Mr. Ellis is angry, but anger alone does not make a murderer. We must learn where he was when the shop was locked." Their final encounter was unplanned. As they passed the churchyard, Miss Clara Trent emerged from a side path, her thin frame clad in a severe grey coat, a basket over her arm. Her face, usually pinched with disapproval, softened briefly at the sight of Miss Marple, but her eyes were wary. "Good afternoon, Miss Trent," Miss Marple said kindly. "A sad day for St. Mary Mead, is it not?" Miss Trent's lips pursed. Sad, yes. Mr. Finch was a presence in the village, but he had a cruel tongue. Not everyone forgets such things. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, interjected. "I heard he teased you about your cooking, Miss Trent. That must have stung." Miss Trent's cheeks reddened, and her voice grew sharp. "He had no right to mock me. I bought my meat like anyone else, but I was by the river this morning, far from his shop. I know nothing of his death." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alert to the defensiveness in Miss Trent's tone. As they parted, she said to Mrs. Bantry, "Miss Trent is quick to place herself elsewhere, yet her basket is empty, and the river path is not far from the shop's back door." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from the stitches. Tom Carver's sullenness, Mrs. Finch's reserve, Mr. Ellis's anger, Miss Trent's pride, each was a motive, each a clue. "The heart of a village is its people," she murmured, "and their secrets are its shadows. We shall see which shadow falls over Mr. Finch's grave." Chapter 4. A Question of Time. The evening draped St. Mary Mead in a soft veil of twilight, the lamps along the high street flickering to life as the village settled into its nightly rhythm. In her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles paused as she contemplated the day's revelations. The murder of Mr. Harold Finch was a puzzle, its pieces scattered across the ordinary lives of the village, and time, she knew, was the thread that might bind them together. The coroner's report, delivered to Constable Hurst and whispered about at the Blue Boar Inn, had placed the time of death between 8 and 9 in the morning, a narrow window when the butcher's shop was locked for a delivery. This detail, so precise, yet so limiting, intrigued Miss Marple, for it suggested a killer who moved with purpose and precision. She rose, adjusting her shawl, and stepped to the window, where the silhouette of the church spire stood against the deepening sky. Her nephew, Raymond West, had arrived that afternoon, his literary curiosity piqued by the village's drama. He lounged in an armchair, his modern scepticism a contrast to his aunt's quiet insight. "Really, Aunt Jane," he said, flipping through a novel, "this murder seems a straightforward affair. A locked shop, a brutal weapon. Surely it's a crime of passion, committed by someone who slipped in and out before anyone noticed." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she turned to him. "Passion, Raymond, is rarely so tidy. A locked shop limits access, but it does not limit intent. We must consider who could have entered, and when, and why they chose that moment. Time, you see, is a most revealing accomplice." The next morning, Miss Marple set out to test this notion, her steps taking her to the high street, where the butcher's shop remained sealed, its red awning a sombre reminder of the tragedy. She paused at the post office, where Mrs. Price, ever eager to share news, was sorting letters. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "Such a sad business with Mr. Finch. I understand the shop was locked during the delivery hour. Did you notice anyone about that morning, between 8 and 9? Mrs. Price's eyes gleamed with the thrill of being consulted. "Well, Miss Marple, it's funny you should ask. I was at my counter, you see, and I did see Mr. Ellis pass by around 8:30, looking cross, as you please. He didn't stop, mind, just marched past toward the market. And then there was young Tom Carver, coming back from the market a bit later, closer to 9. He looked in a state, all flushed and hurried." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away these observations. "And Mrs. Finch, or perhaps Miss Trent, they're often about early, aren't they?" Mrs. Price hesitated, then leaned closer. "Mrs. Finch, I didn't see. but she's always upstairs in the mornings, or so she says. As for Miss Trent, I couldn't say for certain, but I heard she was walking by the river. She's a queer one, that Miss Trent. Always so particular, but touchy as anything. Thanking Mrs. Price, Miss Marple continued her walk, her thoughts turning to the alibis, or lack thereof. Tom Carver, the apprentice, had claimed he was at the market fetching supplies, but Mrs. Price's account suggested he returned later than expected. Mrs. Finch, upstairs in the flat above the shop, insisted she heard nothing, a claim that strained credulity given the violence of the act. Mr. Ellis, passing by at 8:30, admitted his presence, but denied entering the shop, and Miss Clara Trent, with her vague talk of a river walk, offered no witnesses to confirm her whereabouts. At the vicarage, Miss Marple found Mrs. Finch in the same parlour, her composure as unyielding as the day before. The widow sat with a cup of tea untouched, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Marple, offering a sympathetic smile, sat opposite her. Mrs. Finch, she began. It must be trying, answering so many questions, but I wonder if you could help clarify something. The shop was locked from 8 to 9, was it not? For the delivery? Mrs. Finch's eyes flickered, but her voice was steady. Yes, that's right. Harold always locked the shop during deliveries to keep things orderly. I was upstairs, as I said, sewing. I didn't hear anything until Tom came shouting. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. It's a small flat, isn't it? Sound carries easily. A cry, perhaps, or the sound of a struggle. Nothing reached you. A faint flush crept into Mrs. Finch's cheeks. It was a busy morning. I was distracted. The sewing machine, you know, it makes a noise. Miss Marple nodded, though her mind noted the hesitation, the slight tremor in Mrs. Finch's hands. She rose, thanking the widow, and stepped outside, where Raymond waited, his impatience evident. Any luck, Aunt Jane? He asked. Or are you still chasing shadows? Not shadows, Raymond, she replied, her voice soft but firm. Moments. The moment of Mr. Finch's death is the key. Whoever struck him knew the shop would be locked, knew they had a brief window to act unseen. Their next stop was the market, where Tom Carver was said to have been. The market square, bustling with stalls and vendors, was a short walk from the high street. Miss Marple approached Mr. Hodge, a fruit seller, whose stall faced the road to the butcher's shop. Good day, Mr. Hodge, she said, selecting an apple with care. I understand Tom Carver was here yesterday morning, fetching supplies for Mr. Finch. Did you see him? Mr. Hodge, wiping his hands on his apron, nodded. Aye, he was here, but not till nearly 9. Said he'd been delayed. Something about a cart breaking down. Looked out of sorts, he did, all twitchy and pale. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. Tom's delay suggested he was not at the shop during the critical hour, yet his agitation upon returning hinted at more than a broken cart. She recalled his sullen demeanour by the lamp-post, the way his hands twisted that piece of string. A young man with a grievance, she murmured to Raymond, is a dangerous thing. But is it guilt or merely fear? Their final inquiry took them to the river path, where Miss Clara Trent had claimed to be walking. The path, shaded by willows, ran parallel to the back of the high street, its muddy banks dotted with footprints. Miss Marple, leaning lightly on Raymond's arm, examined the ground. Most prints were indistinct, but one caught her eye. A small, neat impression, as if from a woman's boot, pressed deeply into the mud near a stile that led to the shop's back alley. Interesting, she said, pointing it out to Raymond. This path is quiet, but not so far from the shop that one couldn't slip away unnoticed. Raymond frowned. You think Miss Trent lied about her walk? She's a prickly sort, but a murderer. Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. I think, Raymond, that people's stories are like their gardens. carefully tended but with weeds hidden beneath. Miss Trent's walk may be true, but its purpose is another matter. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her chair. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from idle. The hour between 8 and 9 was a narrow stage, and the actors, Tom, Mrs. Finch, Mr. Ellis, Miss Trent, each played a part that did not yet align. The locked shop suggested an inside job, yet the alibis, vague and unverified, pointed to opportunity for all. Time, she said softly, as Raymond looked up from his book, is a strict master. It will tell us who was where and why, if we listen closely enough. Chapter 5. The Ledger's Secret. The morning mist clung to the lanes of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village as if to blur the sharp edges of its recent tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a slice of toast, gazed out at the garden, where dew sparkled on the roses. Her mind, however, was not on the serene beauty of the morning, but on the ledger she had glimpsed in Mr. Finch's shop, a ledger that seemed to her not merely a record of transactions, but a map of motives. Its deliberate placement, the smudged ink, the broken pencil, all suggested a story untold, and Miss Marple was determined to decipher it. Her nephew, Raymond West, joined her, his city-bred impatience tempered by curiosity about his aunt's methods. "You're awfully quiet this morning, Aunt Jane," he remarked, stirring his coffee. "Still thinking about that butcher's shop? I'd wager the police will have it sorted by now. A simple case of robbery, surely." Miss Marple's eyes, pale and piercing, met his with a gentle smile. "Simple cases, Raymond, are rarely as simple as they seem. A robbery leaves chaos, but this murder has a certain order to it. The ledger, for instance. It was not where a butcher would keep it during a busy morning. I should like to know what it contains." Raymond raised an eyebrow. "A ledger? Just numbers and names, isn't it? Hardly a clue to murder." "Numbers and names," Miss Marple replied, "are the language of human dealings. And in those dealings we find greed, deceit, or desperation. I have a notion that Mr. Finch's ledger holds more than sums." Determined to pursue this thread, Miss Marple enlisted Raymond's help in persuading Constable Hurst to allow a closer look at the ledger. The constable, though sceptical of her interest, was swayed by Mrs. Bantry's influence and agreed to a brief examination, provided they touched nothing. At the butcher's shop, now silent and shadowed, Miss Marple stood by the small desk in the corner, her gloved hands hovering over the open ledger. Constable Hurst watched her warily, his notebook at the vault ready, as Raymond leaned against the counter, suppressing a yawn. The ledger was a sturdy volume, its pages filled with Mr. Finch's neat, angular handwriting. Rows of figures detailed meat purchases, prices, and customer names. But as Miss Marple turned the pages, irregularities emerged. Certain entries, marked with asterisks, showed inflated prices for select customers, Mr. Ellis, the grocer among them. Others recorded payments that seemed disproportionate to the goods listed, as if Mr. Finch had been pocketing extra sums. Most intriguing was a single page, dated the week before, with a cryptic note in the margin, "CT to settle by Friday." The ink was fresh, the handwriting slightly unsteady, as if written in haste. Miss Marple's fingers paused, her eyes narrowing. "CT," she murmured. "Clara Trent, perhaps, or a clever misdirection. And settle by Friday. That was yesterday, the day of the murder. This note was meant to be seen, I think, but by whom?" Raymond, peering over her shoulder, frowned. "It's just a reminder, isn't it? Maybe Miss Trent owed him money. She's always buying scraps for that cat of hers." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. "But a debt recorded so openly, in a ledger left out for all to see, feels deliberate. Mr. Finch was a careful man with his accounts. This note is a message, or a trap." Constable Hurst, growing impatient, cleared his throat. "If you've seen enough, Miss Marple, I'll need to lock up. The inspector's coming this afternoon, and he'll want everything as it was. Miss Marple closed the ledger gently, her mind racing. Thank you, Constable. You've been most helpful. A small thing, but might I ask, has anyone else seen this ledger since the murder? Hurst shook his head. Only me and the sergeant, and now you. It's been here since we found it. Satisfied, Miss Marple left the shop, her thoughts turning to the note's implications. If CT was indeed Clara Trent, what debt did she owe Mr. Finch? And why was it urgent enough to warrant such a note? If it was not Miss Trent, then who or what was CT? The ledger's irregularities suggested Mr. Finch had been engaged in dubious practices, perhaps overcharging or falsifying accounts, which could have provoked anger among his customers. Mr. Ellis, with his unpaid loan, was an obvious candidate, but Mrs. Finch, too, might have known of her husband's dealings. And Tom Carver, as the apprentice, would have had access to the ledger, perhaps even adding the note himself. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple decided to visit Miss Clara Trent. The spinster lived in a small cottage at the edge of the village, its garden meticulously tended, its windows curtained against prying eyes. Miss Marple knocked, her posy of flowers a pretext for the visit, and was admitted by Miss Trent, whose sharp features softened only slightly at the sight of her guest. The parlour was austere, with a single photograph of a stern-looking woman on the mantelpiece and a cat curled in a basket by the fire. "Good morning, Miss Trent," Miss Marple said, settling into a stiff-backed chair. "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought you might appreciate a few flowers, given the sad events at the butcher's shop." Miss Trent's hands, busy with a piece of embroidery, stilled. "Very kind of you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped. "It's a terrible thing, Mr. Finch's death. I was by the river when it happened, as I told you." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes resting on Miss Trent's flushed cheeks. "Yes, a peaceful walk, I'm sure, though I understand Mr. Finch's shop was a busy place. Did you ever have cause to discuss his accounts with him? I hear he was particular about his books." Miss Trent's needle paused, and her eyes darted to Miss Marple's. "Accounts? I bought my meat like anyone else. I owed him nothing, if that's what you mean." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "Only a ledger can reveal so much about a business and its customers. A note about a debt, for instance, might cause embarrassment if misunderstood." Miss Trent's flush deepened, and her voice grew sharp. "If there was such a note, it wasn't about me. Mr. Finch was a rude man, always joking at others' expense. But I had no quarrel with him worth that." Miss Marple thanked her and took her leave, noting the tremor in Miss Trent's hands as she closed the door. The spinster's denial was vehement, but her agitation suggested a truth she was reluctant to share. Was the note a reference to a real debt, or a fabrication meant to cast suspicion? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mrs. Finch, who might know more about her husband's financial dealings. At the vicarage, Miss Marple found Mrs. Finch alone in the parlour, her composure fraying at the edges. The widow's hands twisted a handkerchief, and her eyes, red-rimmed, avoided Miss Marple's gaze. "Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple began, "I've been thinking about your husband's shop. His ledger showed some irregularities, overcharges, perhaps, or payments not quite accounted for. Did he ever mention such things to you?" Mrs. Finch's hands stilled, and for a moment silence hung heavy in the room. Then, in a rush, she spoke. "Harold was clever with money, too clever sometimes. I knew he charged some customers more, but it was his business, not mine. I told him it would cause trouble, but he laughed it off, said it was just business." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. "And this note, CT to settle by Friday. Did he mention anything about Miss Trent or anyone else?" Mrs. Finch's eyes widened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know about any note, but Harold, he had his secrets. He'd come home sometimes, muttering about people owing him. But he never said who. I swear I had nothing to do with his death. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the crack in Mrs. Finch's facade. The widow knew more than she admitted, but whether it was guilt or fear remained unclear. As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the ledger. Its irregularities pointed to a pattern of deceit, and the note, with its cryptic initials, was a clue deliberately placed or overlooked. "A ledger," she murmured to Raymond, who had joined her on the walk back, "is a mirror of a man's dealings. And in Mr. Finch's mirror, we see shadows of those who wished him harm." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire. Her knitting resumed, but her mind far from idle. The ledger's secret was a key, but to which lock? Tom Carver, with his access to the shop. Mrs. Finch, with her knowledge of her husband's ways. Mr. Ellis, cheated and resentful. Or Miss Trent, whose pride might hide a deeper grievance. The truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the interplay of these motives, and she would unravel it with the patience of a knitter untangling a knot. Chapter 6. A Village Secret. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead's Women's Institute, casting delicate patterns on the polished wooden floor where the women of the village gathered. The air was thick with the scent of lavender polish and freshly baked scones, but the usual chatter of recipes and charity drives was overshadowed by a more sombre topic, the murder of Mr. Harold Finch. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her knitting in her lap, listened as the conversation swirled around her, each voice adding a thread to the tapestry of suspicion that now cloaked the village. Her needles moved rhythmically, but her mind was alert, sifting through the gossip for the glint of truth. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, presiding over the meeting with her usual vigour, steered the discussion toward the tragedy, her eyes darting to Miss Marple as if seeking her approval. "It's simply dreadful," she declared, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "Poor Mr. Finch, struck down in his own shop. And to think it happened in broad daylight, with the village going about its business. Surely someone must have seen something." Mrs. Price, the postmistress, leaned forward, her teacup clinking against its saucer. "I heard young Tom Carver was in a state when he found the body. They say he and Mr. Finch had a falling out, something about wages, or perhaps more. And then there's Miss Clara Trent. Mrs. Hodge at the market told me she saw Clara arguing with Tom near the churchyard a few days ago. Quite heated it was. All about promises broken." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Promises broken," she repeated softly, as if to herself. "That is most interesting, Mrs. Price. People's quarrels often reveal more than their agreements. Did Mrs. Hodge say anything else?" Mrs. Price, flattered by the attention, nodded eagerly. "Only that Miss Trent looked furious, and Tom was red in the face, muttering something about not being pushed around. It's odd, isn't it? Miss Trent's so proper, but she's got a temper when riled." The room buzzed with agreement, and Miss Marple filed this information away, her thoughts turning to the unlikely pairing of Tom Carver and Clara Trent. A sullen apprentice and a prickly spinster. What promise could bind them? And how might it connect to Mr. Finch's death? She recalled the small boot print near the shop's back door, too delicate for a man's foot, and wondered if Miss Trent's river walk was as innocent as she claimed. As the meeting adjourned, Miss Marple lingered, her conversation with Mrs. Bantry turning to another figure in the village's drama. "Dolly," she said, her voice low, "I've heard Mr. Ellis and Mr. Finch were rivals, not just in business, but in matters of the heart. Is there truth to that?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, and she lowered her voice to match Miss Marple's. "Oh, Jane, you've hit on something there. Years ago, before Alice married Harold Finch, Mr. Ellis was sweet on her. He courted her, brought her flowers, the lot. But Harold won her over, some say with charm, others with promises of a better life. Mr. Ellis never forgave him, and that loan business only made it worse. Do you think it matters? Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Everything matters, Dolly, when it comes to human nature. Old wounds can fester, and a man scorned may carry a grudge longer than we expect. Determined to explore this further, Miss Marple set out for a walk, her steps taking her past the butcher's shop, where the cordon remained in place. The back alley, narrow and shadowed by high hedges, beckoned her attention. She paused, her eyes scanning the ground for the boot print she had noticed before. It was still there, faint but distinct, its edges softened by the morning's dew. Nearby, a scrap of fabric, a thread of grey wool, caught on a bramble, fluttered in the breeze. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her fingers brushing the thread. "Grey wool," she murmured. "Miss Trent favours grey, does she not? And this alley leads to the river path." She straightened, her mind weaving connections. The print, the thread, the argument between Tom and Miss Trent, all pointed to a secret that lay just beneath the village's surface. But what was it? And how did it lead to murder? Miss Marple resolved to speak with Tom Carver, whose sullen demeanour and vague alibi made him a figure of interest. She found him at the Blue Boar Inn, nursing a pint in a corner, his cap pulled low. Approaching with her usual unobtrusive grace, Miss Marple greeted him warmly. "Good afternoon, Tom. It must be a trying time for you, with Mr. Finch gone so suddenly. I understand you were at the market that morning." Tom's eyes, wary and shadowed, met hers briefly before dropping to his. Glass. "Aye, Miss Marple. I was fetching supplies, like always. Got delayed by a cart, didn't get back till near 9. That's when I found him." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. "A terrible shock, I'm sure. I heard you and Mr. Finch had words recently. About wages, perhaps." Tom's hands tightened around his glass. He was tight-fisted, that's all. Kept promising me more, but never paid up. We argued, sure, but I didn't kill him. "And Miss Trent?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but probing. "I heard you spoke with her a few days ago, near the churchyard. Something about a promise." Tom's face flushed, and he shifted uncomfortably. "That's nothing to do with this. She was on about some nonsense. Said I'd promised to help with her garden, but I never did. She's always pestering folk." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind turning over his words. Tom's denial was too quick, his agitation too pronounced. The promise, whatever it was, held significance, and Miss Trent's involvement suggested a deeper connection. She recalled the ledger's note, CT, to settle by Friday, and wondered if it referred not to a debt but to a promise, perhaps one tied to the village's past. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts far from the stitches. The village secret was elusive, but its outlines were emerging. Tom's quarrel with Miss Trent, Mr. Ellis's old love for Mrs. Finch, the grey thread in the alley, all were clues, small but telling. "Secrets," she murmured to Raymond, who had joined her for tea, "are like seeds buried in the earth. They lie hidden until the right moment, and then they break through. We must find what broke through in Mr. Finch's shop." Raymond, ever the sceptic, chuckled. "You make it sound like a novel, Aunt Jane, but I suppose you'll unravel it, as you always do." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Not unravel, Raymond. Reveal. The truth is there, in the secrets people keep and the promises they break. We need only look closely." Chapter 7. The trap is set. The soft glow of lamplight bathed Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting a warm halo over the chintz armchairs and the polished mahogany table where a tea tray stood ready. Outside, St. Mary Mead was settling into the quiet of early evening, the village's usual hum subdued by the weight of Mr. Harold Finch's unsolved murder. Miss Marple, her knitting neatly folded in her lap, surveyed the room with a calm that belied the calculated purpose in her mind. She had decided to set a trap, not with force or confrontation, but with the subtle art of conversation, for she knew that truth often slipped out when people were caught off guard. The ledger's cryptic note, the grey thread in the alley, the whispered village secrets, all pointed to a web of motives, and she intended to tug at its strands. Her plan was simple yet deliberate, a small tea gathering at her cottage, to which she invited Mrs. Finch, Miss Clara Trent, and Mr. Ellis. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever eager to assist, had helped arrange it, framing the invitation as a gesture of condolence and community. Miss Marple knew that bringing these figures together, under the guise of polite company, would stir tensions and perhaps coax a revealing misstep. She had also asked Constable Hurst to ensure that Tom Carver, under the pretext of delivering a parcel, would be present at a critical moment. People, she had said to Raymond West earlier that day, are most themselves when they think no one is watching. We shall see who falters. As the guests arrived, Miss Marple greeted them with her characteristic warmth, her frail figure and gentle smile, disarming even the most guarded. Mrs. Finch entered first, her dark dress accentuating her pallor, her hands clasped tightly as if to anchor her composure. Miss Trent followed, her grey coat immaculate, her eyes darting with a wariness that belied her prim demeanour. Mr. Ellis, his sharp features set in a scowl, brought up the rear, muttering about the inconvenience but unable to resist the summons of village propriety. Mrs. Bantry, playing hostess with gusto, bustled about with teacups and plates of scones, her chatter filling the room with a semblance of normalcy. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, began with pleasantries, her voice soft but deliberate. "It is a sad time for St. Mary Mead," she said, her eyes moving from one guest to another. "Mr. Finch's death has left us all shaken. I find it comforting to gather together, to share our thoughts and perhaps ease the burden of grief." Mrs. Finch nodded, her lips tight. "It's kind of you, Miss Marple. I'm managing, but it's hard, not knowing who could do such a thing." Miss Trent, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigour, added, "A terrible act. I was by the river that morning, as I've said, far from the shop." Her words were clipped, almost rehearsed. Mr. Ellis snorted, his hands gripping his cup. "Finch had enemies, that's no secret. Cheated half the village, he did. I was at the market by 8:30, minding my own business." Miss Marple's eyes, pale and perceptive, lingered on each speaker, noting the tension in Mrs. Finch's hands, the flush in Miss Trent's cheeks, the defiance in Mr. Ellis's tone. She sipped her tea, then set it down with care. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said, her voice almost musing. "How a ledger can reveal so much about a man's life. Mr. Finch's account showed some irregularities, and a note, CT, to settle by Friday. I understand it was traced to a specific debt, one that caused some distress." The room stilled. Mrs. Finch's cup trembled, clinking against its saucer. Miss Trent's spoon froze mid-stir, her eyes wide. Mr. Ellis's scowl deepened, his fingers tightening on his chair. "A debt," he growled. "If you're pointing at me, Miss Marple, I'll have you know Finch owed me, not the other way round." Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture soothing. "Oh, not you, Mr. Ellis. The note was quite specific. But debts, you see, are not always about money. They can be promises, or secrets, or slights unpaid." Her gaze drifted to Miss Trent, who flushed crimson and looked away. At that moment, Tom Carver appeared at the door, a parcel under his arm, his face pale and his eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple, with a nod to Mrs. Bantry, continued, her voice casual but pointed. "And then, there's the matter of a witness. Someone saw a figure leaving the shop at 8:45, just after the murder. A small detail, but so telling." Miss Trent gasped, her hand flying to her mouth before she recovered. "I was by the river, I tell you. No one could have seen me at the shop. It's nonsense." Mrs. Finch, her composure cracking, set her cup down with a clatter. "I was upstairs," she said, her voice rising. "I told you, I heard nothing. But Harold, he was cruel sometimes, pushing people too far. I confronted him that morning about his tricks with the accounts. We argued, but I left him alive, I swear it." Mr. Ellis's eyes narrowed, flicking between the women. "Sounds like you all had reason to hate him. Me, I was at the market. Ask anyone." Tom, still hovering by the door, shifted uncomfortably, his parcel forgotten. Miss Marple's gaze settled on him. "And you, Tom? You were delayed at the market, you said. Yet you were seen near the churchyard earlier with Miss Trent. Promises broken, I believe." Tom's face reddened, and he stammered. "That was nothing. She was on about her garden, like I said. I didn't go near the shop till 9. Miss Marple nodded, her trap sprung. The witness was a fabrication, a gentle prod to elicit reactions, and the responses were revealing. Mrs. Finch's confession of an argument, Miss Trent's panic, Tom's defensiveness, Mr. Ellis's quick alibi, each betrayed a thread of guilt or fear. She rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and thanked her guests, her smile as serene as ever. "You've all been most helpful," she said. "The truth has a way of showing itself in time." As the guests departed, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple, her eyes wide. "Jane, you're a marvel. Did you see their faces? Mrs. Finch, practically confessing, and Miss Trent, why, she looked ready to bolt." Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting resumed. "They all have secrets, Dolly, but not all secrets are murderous. Mrs. Finch's argument may be true, but it does not make her a killer. Miss Trent's fear suggests something deeper, perhaps tied to that note in the ledger. And Tom, his connection to Miss Trent is a puzzle yet to be solved." Raymond, who had observed from a corner, chuckled. "You're playing chess with them, Aunt Jane, moving pieces until they betray themselves. But what now?" "Now," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. "We wait. The trap has stirred them, and those who are guilty will act. We need only watch, and the truth will step into the light." Chapter 8. The Truth Unravelled. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill, as if the village itself shivered at the weight of its secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, the fire casting a gentle glow across her knitting, which lay untouched in her lap. The trap she had set at her tea gathering had borne fruit, stirring reactions that illuminated the shadows of Mr. Harold Finch's murder, the ledger's cryptic note, the grey thread in the alley, the bootprint by the river, and the tensions among her guests. All were pieces of a puzzle now nearing completion. Miss Marple knew that truth, like a carefully knitted pattern, emerged when every stitch was in place. Her nephew, Raymond West, had retired to his room with a novel, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She had summoned Constable Hurst earlier, requesting a private meeting at her cottage, and now, as the clock struck 7, his heavy tread sounded on the garden path. He entered, his face a mixture of respect and scepticism, his notebook clutched tightly. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap. "Mrs. Bantry says you've something to tell me about the Finch case. I hope it's solid, as the inspector's getting impatient." Miss Marple's smile was serene, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Please, Constable, sit. I believe we can resolve this matter tonight. The truth lies in the small things, details overlooked, like a thread caught on a bramble or a note in a ledger. Shall I explain?" Hurst nodded, settling into a chair, and Miss Marple began, her voice soft but steady. "Mr. Finch's murder was no act of impulse. The locked shop, the meat cleaver, the ledger's note, all point to a killer who knew his habits and planned their moment. Let us consider the evidence. The shop was locked from 8 to 9 for a delivery, yet someone entered, struck Mr. Finch, and left without being seen. The back door, with its faint scratch, suggests a key or a tool was used by someone familiar with the shop's layout. She paused, her fingers brushing the wool in her lap. Tom Carver, the apprentice, claimed he was delayed at the market until 9. Mr. Hodge confirmed this, noting Tom's agitation when he returned. But Tom's argument with Miss Trent, overheard near the churchyard, and his nervousness at my tea suggest he knows more than he admits. Mrs. Finch, too, confessed to a quarrel with her husband that morning about his dishonest accounts. Her composure, though, is not that of a killer, but of one guarding a painful truth. Hurst scribbled in his notebook, his brow furrowed. And Mr. Ellis, he's got motive, with that old debt and his history with Mrs. Finch. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Mr. Ellis's anger is real, but his alibi, passing the shop at 8:30, seen by Mrs. Price, holds firm. He was at the market when the murder occurred. No, the key lies elsewhere in the ledger's note, CT to settle by Friday, and in the alley where a grey thread and a small boot print were found. Hurst leaned forward. You think it's Miss Trent then? That CT is her? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. It seems obvious, doesn't it? But the obvious is often a distraction. I visited Miss Trent again this afternoon after our tea. She was flustered, her embroidery scattered, and her grey coat, matching that thread, was hung by the door, its hem slightly muddy. I asked about her walk by the river, and she grew defensive, insisting she owed Mr. Finch nothing. But her eyes betrayed fear, not of debt, but of exposure. She leaned forward, her voice lowering. Miss Trent, you see, had a secret, not a debt, but a past indiscretion. Years ago, as a young woman, she was involved in a scandal, a brief romance that ended in disgrace, known only to a few. Mr. Finch, with his sharp tongue and sharper memory, discovered this. He was not above blackmail, using his ledger to record debts that were not always financial. The note CT to settle by Friday was his demand for payment, not in money, but in silence or favour. Hurst's eyes widened. Blackmail? You're saying Finch was squeezing her? Precisely, Miss Marple said. At our tea, Miss Trent's reaction to my fabricated witness was telling. She panicked, fearing someone had seen her near the shop. I believe she went there that morning, not by the front door, but through the back, using a key she'd once been given as a trusted customer. She confronted Mr. Finch, perhaps to plead or threaten. His mockery, as always, was cruel. In a moment of rage, she seized the cleaver, a weapon at hand, and struck him. Then, to cover her tracks, she staged a robbery, scattering crates and overturning the scale, but left the ledger open, hoping its note would point elsewhere. Hurst shook his head. But the boot print, the thread, how can you be sure it's her? Miss Marple's smile was gentle. The print was small, a woman's size, and the thread matched her coat. Her argument with Tom Carver about promises broken was likely her attempt to enlist his help, perhaps to retrieve something from the shop. Tom, loyal but resentful, refused, which explains his guilt and silence. Mrs. Finch knew of her husband's blackmail, but feared exposing it, lest it taint her own reputation. Mr. Ellis, though bitter, had no part in the act. Convinced, Hurst rose. I'll bring Miss Trent in for questioning. If she confesses, we'll have our case. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Be gentle, Constable. She is a proud woman, driven to desperation. Pride, you see, is a dangerous thing when wounded. Later that evening, Miss Trent, under Hurst's quiet but firm questioning, broke down. She admitted confronting Mr. Finch about his blackmail, which threatened to ruin her reputation over a long-buried indiscretion. His taunts had pushed her to a breaking point, and in a flash of fury, she had used the cleaver, then fled through the back door, leaving the ledger to mislead. I couldn't bear his laughter, she sobbed. It was like he held my life in his hands. As Miss Trent was led away, St. Mary Mead exhaled.